Hi, and welcome to episode 100 of the Breaking Bio podcast. Can you believe we're at 100? Where has 3.5 years gone? I honestly don't know. I'm Morgan. I'm a PhD student at the University of Guelph in Ontario, Canada.
I'm Heidi Parker. I'm a postdoc at the University of Texas at Austin.
I'm Tom Housley. I'm a postdoc at the University of Exeter in Penryn.
And like I said, this is episode 100, which is amazing. Can't believe we've actually made it this far. So much has happened in, like I said, 3.5 years. Sam was free. We've talked to a whole bunch of excellent people, and hopefully we'll carry on for a long time. Just like we did with episode 50, which was a pretty big landmark at that time, we've got another big guest that we're really excited to share with everybody this week and to talk about, and he's doing all sorts of cool stuff, and I think you guys at home who are listening will be very familiar. And our guest, obviously, is Dr. Doug Emlen, who is a professor of biological sciences at the University of Montana and also a prolific author, scientist, and everything else that we all aspire to be. So thank you so much, Doug, for joining us this week. Can you tell everybody at home a little bit about what you have been doing so successfully?
Sure. Thank you, and it's a pleasure to be here talking with you guys. I'm an evolutionary biologist. I work on animal weapons, but I work on a particular subset. So the research that we do focuses on horns and extreme structures in insects, and primarily the horns in big mandibles in rhinoceros and stag beetles. And so for the past 10 or so years, we've been doing a lot of developmental biology and a lot more candidate gene and developmental genetics, starting to look at how weapons get big, why they get big, and why these crazy structures are so insanely diverse. So I'm a professor at the University of Montana, and we work all over the world, primarily these days in Asia, on rhinoceros beetles. But that's not why you've got me here, I don't think.
Oh, we've got you here for all of it. So we'll definitely get to the book, which if anybody's not familiar with it, of course, is Animal Weapons, The Evolution of Battle, which Doug published last year, and which I think is highly acclaimed, at least by me. So we'll definitely get into that. But I think we also want to talk about all of your other research on evolutionary biology and the evolution of weapons that you've been working on for a long time. So maybe I'll start. So how did you get interested in animal weapons? You say early in the book that you've always sort of been fascinated with this field of research, but what was it that drew you to the evolution of weaponry and battle systems in animals?
Sure. So there's sort of the quick and easy and then the slightly longer answer to that. And since this is your 100th episode, I'm going to give you the slightly longer answer to that. I grew up, I was raised in a household that was immersed in biology. So my father is a evolutionary biologist that works on birds, and his dad was a bird biologist before him, and my stepfather was a biologist. I was completely surrounded by biology and dragged to all kinds of cool places as a kid, following along in my dad's footsteps and helping him on projects banding birds in Kenya. Went to school in Kenya for 6 months as a child and helped him as a field slave on his work in Panama. And so I knew I loved biology, and I knew I loved field biology in particular, the sort of macho aspect of getting out into extreme environments and really trying to figure out what's going on out there. Long before I knew exactly what I wanted to work on in particular. And I was a rebel in a rather pathetic sense, because I still do animal behavior, I still do evolution, and I still try to get out into the field. But I was a rebel because I wanted to work on insects. And you know, so much of the focus of my dad and his dad had been birds. And I started as a graduate student poking around, looking in insect drawers, and starting to try to figure out what kinds of animals and what kinds of questions I really wanted to work on. And pretty quickly, it was clear to me that I wanted to work on the extremes. I really was drawn to things that look like they shouldn't work. I mean, the animals with things sticking off of them that are so big or so awkward that, I mean, honestly, if you weren't a biologist and you weren't used to looking at these things, if you were an alien coming from another planet and you walked in and you looked at something like that cold, I mean, you'd be hard-pressed to imagine how something like that could exist. How it could literally carry the weight without tripping and falling on its face, much less how things like that could be favored in natural populations and do better than individuals in those populations that didn't have those outlandish structures. And so I fell in love with the extremes. And I was really in love with insects. And you put those two together and it's a happy marriage, because there is so much diversity in insects. And when you start looking at that diversity, there are an awful lot of extremes. I mean, there are insects pinned in little drawers that, you know, you get a chance to start pouring through these things and looking. It's mind-blowing how many things there are in pin drawers of insects that look like they shouldn't be possible, that are extremes. And so from there, it was a pretty easy step to beetles. Spectacularly diverse group of organisms with incredible diversity in morphology. And when you look at beetles, the extremes are the horns, they're weapons. And so first I fell in love with the impossibility of these creatures, the charisma of these creatures. But then I also fell in love with the questions and the sort of backstory behind these traits. It was clear pretty fast that these were weapons. And it was clear pretty fast that they were probably sexually selected weapons, so weapons that were born primarily by the males and that were used in battles between males over access to females. And you'd almost think the story's done right there. That seems so intuitive. But it turns out that it's not. And it turns out there's an awful lot we don't know. Despite sexual selection having been an incredibly popular field, even all the way back when I was a grad student, the overwhelming majority of the work in that field focuses on the sort of other half of sexual selection, female choice of ornaments and displays. And so here were all these incredible structures, and they were relatively understudied, and we knew a whole lot less about how they evolved or why they evolved. And so that was sort of the opening for me, and I've spent quite a bit of my life now, as I say, looking all over the world, looking at the craziest of the crazy that I can find, but trying to sort of open the hood and look both at how they do it, so how you build a structure that's that insanely big, and also why you do it. And how these things are used in the wild, and why selection might favor such extremes. So that's the long answer. I can give you the quick one, and you can edit that out if you want to.
That was a pretty great answer.
Yeah, that was a great answer. That's a really good introduction to the book as well. And so in the book, you talk about animal weapons and many examples of, and I love the stories about early field work, but many examples of animal weapons and ornamentation. And then there's always a parallel story to these ideas of human weapons and all this stuff. Was this something like, were you really interested in military history before, or was this just something you did research for the book?
So first of all, I confess I'm odd that way perhaps, but I actually love reading military history anyway. I tend to read a lot of World War II history, and I don't know what it is, but I like history. I like trying to imagine what it was like in the past and putting myself in the situation of where these events took place and trying to picture what was going on in the people's minds that were standing on the same piece of ground in exactly the same place. There's sort of a timeless element that I get this irrational rush from, and I love. So I read history anyway. But actually, oddly enough, despite all this time I've been reading things like, backstories of the war in the Pacific, I never was thinking about it as a parallel. I wasn't thinking about it in the same way. I was reading it because I like history. And so the odd thing, that the side story on the book is, after all these years of working on beetles, I had sort of a lull. We were in between NSF grants. There was sort of a lull in the stuff that was going on in my lab, and most of my resource, my funding, was getting channeled into my graduate students' projects. And I had an opportunity to step back and do something different. And I started pouring through the literature on all these other kinds of crazy animals. I knew they were there. I'd been collecting papers on them for 20 years. Every time I found a paper on a really obnoxiously bizarre critter, I'd file it away. But academia being academia, I never had time to read those things. And so finally I sat down and I started pouring through all these things, and my goal was to try to write a book that told their story. And I had an ulterior motive, I admit. I mean, I'm an evolutionary biologist, and I happen to live in a society that has there's no polite way to put it. The latest statistics say that 46% of the people in my country don't accept the fundamental tenets of evolutionary biology. So here I am, a biologist that thinks that I'm working in a discipline that is unbelievably important and relevant and critical to advances in medicine, advances in genetics, advances in agriculture. I mean, here's this crucial element of biology that an enormous segment of society doesn't get and actually actively resists. And so I had my ulterior motive. I wanted to write a book that would try to make evolutionary biology fun and light and relevant, not a in-your-face, this is why you have to accept evolution. There already are really good books that do that, and I don't think they work particularly well. I wanted to write stories about animals that were so fun and interesting, and the animals were so charismatic that people would read the stories because of the stories. And I would use that as a vehicle to start to introduce some of the critical tenets of evolution. So that was my goal. I set out to write this book. I was having a blast. But it was people connected to my publisher and my editor, people like that kept saying, we think you need to look at the military weapons too. And I honestly resisted it at first. I mean, I love that stuff, but I didn't feel qualified to write about that stuff. I was terrified at the prospect of publishing on military history because I'm not a military historian. I work on beetles. But I started looking, and I started looking at this literature and looking at it in a new light and thinking about it in terms of the weapons and starting to say, okay, why are military weapons getting big? And it turns out there are brilliant people that have spent a lot of time asking that same question. Why do we get into arms races? Why do they begin? What makes an arms race end? And they aren't evolutionary biologists. They don't work on animal behavior. They're not thinking about antlers. They're looking at arms races and ancient naval technologies and things like that. And so it started out as a lark, as sort of a fun thing I did just because my editors were nagging. It became something that I started to sort of ease into. I got more and more excited, and I started thinking, okay, the parallels are at least superficial, but it's a way to get people excited. If my goal is to try to make evolutionary biology relevant, then if I'm going to tell an animal story and there's a military parallel, why not? And I started going back and forth, and then my editors kept saying, oh my gosh, we want more. This is great. You need more. And so it started as a little bit at the end. It got pulled further into the book. Then finally they're like, hey, you don't have any military in this chapter. You need one in every chapter. And I had it initially with animal examples, and then I would have a box to sort of separate the military thing as a little lark of a fun parallel. And then they kept saying, no, 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 we want an integrated back and forth, seamless. And so by the end of this process, a couple things happened. First of all, half the book is dedicated to the military now. So what started out as a crazy, lunatic idea turned out to be all-consuming and ended up being half the book. But the other thing that happened, the thing that blew me away, is I became more and more convinced that these parallels are real. These aren't just superficial parallels that help make evolution feel relevant. These are tangible, palpable parallels that have fundamental insights. So I feel, oddly enough, like reading the military literature has completely transformed how I look at biology. It has changed the kinds of questions we're asking in my lab. It sparked what in the moment are two separate major review papers that I'm currently working on with former students and colleagues of mine that we think are going to completely change the way people in animal behavior and evolutionary biology study weapons. So these are fundamental changes in the ways that we're looking at our systems that came from the military literature, for crying out loud. And then, the military aren't as inclined to listen to me because I'm a beetle biologist. But I'm also convinced that there are insights from animals that have some shocking and perhaps scary relevance to things like national security. So here again, I gave you a long answer. I know we're not supposed to do that, but the fact was, it was quite a journey. I started out trying to do one thing, and I ended up with something very, very different, but also something that I'm wildly excited about and can't stop thinking about. I mean, I really think that some of these parallels are important. So it was, honestly, I love my job. I love my beetles. I love the research that we do. I love mentoring students. I mean, I have my dream job, but of all the things that I have been fortunate enough to do in the 20 or so years I've been practicing as a card-carrying biologist, writing this book, hands down, was the best. It was the most intense experience yet, and I'm still riding that high, I guess. The book hasn't sold particularly well, so it's not like we're going to be buying a second house or anything like that. But intellectually, it was an incredible experience.
It's an incredible book. You're a great storyteller.
Thank you. That didn't come easy either, by the way. I thought it was going to be easy to write a book that would be accessible to a broad audience, and oh my gosh, was I wrong. So there's another story there if you want to talk about that. I learned some pretty profound lessons about what not to do and how to not sound like a professor, which is harder than it seems.
So well, maybe we can come back to again some storytelling tips in a minute. But so I thought you did a really good job in the book about getting people excited about not just the animals with massive weapons and ornaments, but also species that don't have them, and what kind of triggers the weapons evolving and then arms races there, and also with more parallels to human stuff than talking about sort of how economics or theories of economics kind of contribute to this. So at the risk of making you give a précis of your book as a whole, can you just talk briefly about sort of what actually triggers whether weapons evolve?
Sure. And so here again is one of these places where I think it took the combination of the military literature and the biology literature to really put the pieces together. The answer that sort of existed before I set out to write this book, if you go to sort of traditional behavioral ecology ways of thinking, then there are ideas in place about when and why it pays to guard territories, for example. And so, behavioral ecology will tell you that when resources are not dispersed everywhere, but they're clumped and they're relatively rare, then you have things that are economically defensible. It's cost effective to guard them because they're limited, they're not available to everybody, and they're in a localized enough place that it's effective for an animal to plant themselves sort of near it and guard it. So we sort of already knew something about when resources are going to be defensible and when it's going to pay to fight other individuals to hold on to a territory. And we knew a lot about mating systems in animals and why it is, for example, that weapons tend to be in males and not females. And we can relate that back to the differential investment by males and females into offspring. And so behavioral ecology had a pretty good backstory there too, that we expect in many animal populations, particularly those where females invest disproportionately more in offspring than the males do, that you're going to get sort of a surplus of ready males out there that are available for breeding when you don't have that in females. And so you have competition among males for the limited number of available females. And so that was sort of the theoretical framework that was already in place. And honestly, if I hadn't looked at the military literature, I would have stopped there and assumed that's the end of the story. But there was more to the story, and I kind of knew there was more to the story. It was sort of nagging in the back of my mind because I'd spent a lot of years studying animal systems where there are a lot of species with big weapons and a lot of species that don't have big weapons. And often they're very closely related. So the one that was staring me in the face and that I talk a bunch about in the book was dung beetles, where I could be in a forest in Panama or I could be in the Serengeti in Africa. It wouldn't matter. I'd be looking at populations of beetles that are all coming in for these limited resources. And you'd find some species, like the tunneling species, that have these wicked horns, these huge weapons coming off of their bodies. And you'd find other species like the ball rollers that are carving up the hunks of ball and pushing them away across the soil. These guys fight like crazy. They're fighting over limiting economically defensible resources. They've got overabundances of reproductively ready males competing for access to females. They've got all the same prerequisites, and yet they never, ever have horns. So at first pass, the behavioral ecology field sort of had the answer. Males compete for access to females, yes. And when resources are limiting, they're going to fight over them. You get resource defense mating systems, and those tend to be the ones with big weapons. End of story. Problem is, it wasn't the end of the story. If you look closely, it wasn't enough. There are lots of species out there that meet those criteria and don't have arms races and don't have big weapons. And that's where the military came in. When you look at the military literature, these guys had already identified a crucial trigger that precipitates arms races in the military. And it's the idea that it comes down to the details of the fighting, the way that opponents face each other in battle. And in particular, when you get a duel, when you get a one-on-one matchup between two opponents that are relatively evenly matched, that's the kind of situation that can spark greater and greater and greater investment into weapons. And they'd even sort of figured out why. Those kinds of fights are predictable. They're very repeatable, they're often ritualized, and the better fighter tends to win. They're fair fights, if you want to call it that. That tradition traces all the way back, to Homer. I mean, it's been the sort of standard tradition in the military forever. The duels are the fair fights. Those were the honorable fights. And now they were arguing that when you look at duels between tanks, between airplanes, between ships, even between nations, when you look at duels, that's the situation that's going to escalate into an arms race. So these guys were saying duels. Behavioral ecology was saying, competition over resources and males competing for access to females. It's when you put them together that all of a sudden you've got your magic formula. And I got really excited when I put that last piece into the puzzle because duels actually make sense in animal systems. We never thought about it that way. It's like it'd been staring us in front of the face and we never actually saw that pattern. If you look at all the contest theory, you go back to the 70s and the 80s and all the sequential assessment games and the models that sort of pit animals against each other and look at how contests get resolved, they're all duels, not because people knew that was a precondition, but because mathematically that's the way you write the model. You write it with a duel. It's a back and forth type of a dynamic. So all the theory started with duels, although we took it for granted. Nobody paid attention to it. And when you look in the wild, all the systems with these crazy weapons fight in duels. So again, we took it for granted. But when you step back and look at the bigger picture, lots of species don't fight in duels. And it turns out the dung beetles, for example, the ball rollers, fight in these big scrambles. There's all these chaotic piles of individuals that all attack from all angles at once. And in those kinds of fights, the outcome isn't predictable. There's no reason to invest in a weapon. It's too expensive for something that's not going to help you, because the outcome is determined by chance. So I got really excited. When you look across animals, it turns out that duels happen in very predictable situations, which I can come back to if you want me to go into more detail. But that's the crucial prerequisite, I think, now. Competition in one way or another. In the military, competition comes about for other reasons. It has nothing to do with males competing for access to females. In the animal world, it's very often reproductive competition of males competing for females. You have to have some kind of a limited resource that makes it worth going to battle over, but you have that in the military, you have that in animals. And then that crucial missing prerequisite that nobody had really put into biology was this idea of a one-on-one fight or duel. And so I actually think that when you have all three of those conditions, and in particular when you have that last one, the duels, that's the biological trigger, the prerequisite for an arms race.
That's really cool. And I think all of this goes to speak, positively to the things that can come out of reading broadly and not letting yourself get so focused as we sometimes do in academia on the problem that's right in front of us, that we continue butting our heads against the wall, but trying to take a more interdisciplinary approach, which is obviously a buzzword of its own right now.
Sure.
But reading broadly and then taking those lessons learned and putting them into new contexts like you've done here. I think this is an excellent example of how people can do that in their own work, no matter what that work may be.
Good point. I couldn't agree more. It's also fun, by the way. I mean, I guess just by virtue of the crazy path that my own research career has taken, I've had several chances in my life to sort of push into, for me at least, uncharted territory, move into a discipline or a field that I knew very little about, and start sort of jumping off the cliff and immersing yourself, surrounding yourself with a literature that is foreign. It's fun. So I started out interested in animal behavior and sort of basic traditional evolutionary biology. I almost failed my oral comprehensive exams because I didn't know what juvenile hormone was, and it turned out that I knew almost nothing. Okay, I knew nothing about development. I didn't know anything about insect development. And here I was studying this trait that's exquisitely phenotypically plastic, and I didn't have a clue what the mechanisms were. And so I went and did a postdoc learning about development. And I still remember going into the library. It's like, oh, I wonder if they have a journal on development. And they have like a whole building. It's like the developmental biology literature was an order of magnitude bigger than anything I've ever had exposure to in animal behavior or evolutionary biology. It was this huge field, and I knew nothing about it. But it's exciting, and having to dig in and sort of figure out what the questions are that are driving that field, and constantly trying to pull from that literature into my own field and see where there are parallels and where there are things that are relevant. It's incredibly exciting. And then, for me, again, all the genetic tools started to become available. So I had to learn a whole nother literature about sort of evo-devo and candidate genes, and now we're getting into genomics. We're using double digest rad sequence and all these things that I can give you the drop word. Give me 6 months and I'll be there. But I mean, I'm still learning how to use them. It's a whole new literature yet again. So I think it's healthy for all of us as scientists and as citizens to sort of push out of our comfort zone and think about things that are, scary and exciting at the same time, that are new and wildly different. And I kind of believe in doing that anyway within biology. For me to then jump to the military was just a whole nother ballgame there again. I mean, it was even further afield. And yet, in hindsight, it was the most rewarding jump of all. So if there's any lesson in my experience, it's the farther out of your comfort zone you go, the more profound are the insights that are at least possible. They might turn out to be garbage, but it's still a valuable exercise.
Yeah, I almost can't believe that you hadn't made those connections before, because the flow is really natural in the book. I also wondered if you wanted to speculate, or if you know the relationship. Often you talk about closely related species where you see horns in one and not horns in the other. What are the differences then in sperm competition?
Ha! Don't we wish we knew? Okay, so I'm assuming your readership, your listenership is going to be somewhat familiar with sperm competition and sexual selection sort of carrying on after mating. I mean, this wild frontier. I think it's one of the most exciting areas of biology right now, and it's exciting because it's it's unexplored. I mean, it has that same thrill to it that moving in, I suppose exploring the depths of the oceans and things would do too. It's uncharted territory. We never really knew to look at those kinds of things before. And now the more people look, the more they find. And so insects, again, are the champions. That the diversity of internal structures in females and the sperm competition traits and the sperm traits in males is mind-blowing. I love teaching it in my classes. Where are we with the beetles? We're not very far. There's been some neat early work done by Clarissa House and John Hunt. Some of them are at Exeter, Tom, looking at details of the morphology of the males and situations where sperm precedence works one way or another. To my knowledge, that's still some of the best work to date in the beetle systems. We have spent a lot of time lately not working on the dung beetles, which is what I'd initially worked on, but working on the rhinoceros and the stag beetles, and we're only just getting there. So one of the current projects that we have right now with one of the grad students in my lab is going to be measuring selection on the weapons in the wild in populations of rhinoceros beetle that have long or very, very large weapons and then also much shorter weapons so that we can contrast what's happening in these populations. And a huge part of that is a big part of our dissertation is going to be looking at sperm competition traits. We already have sort of anecdotal evidence, and the people that know these populations in Japan have already told us that the genitalic morphologies of these populations are different. We don't know what is going on with the female anatomy, and we haven't had a chance to look at the sperm traits. But when you look across the rhinoceros beetles, there's a number of papers out there hinting that the genitalic morphologies are evolving very, very quickly, and that they're some of the first things to diverge. They actually begin to differ in areas of sympatry. They diverge in areas of sympatry faster than other body parts, which suggests it's going to be a huge part of the story. But it's wide open. Ask me in 3 to 5 years, please.
That'll be the next one. That'll be the next book.
Yeah. No, I think it's going to be really exciting. I think it's, again, I love these instances where there's really cool stuff sort of sitting under your nose and you just had to know to look for it. People have been following the beetles for a long time. The rhinoceros beetles are literally the charismatic megafauna of the insects. These are huge, conspicuous insects. Collectors have loved them forever. And they've spent a lot of time talking about the horns because they're these huge, outrageous things sticking off of the body. But very few people have looked inside them to look at the smaller things. They're not actually that small. The genitalia in these beetles are huge. But they're relatively smaller, and they're inside the body. They're not obvious. You don't see them unless you know to look for them. So again, it's one of those areas where biology is sort of realizing that there's incredible, important things happening that were right in front of our noses for all these years. We just had to know to look for them. And now we're looking. A little too late, later than we should have, perhaps, but we're looking, I promise.
Yeah, I think, and that's come up a lot of times on the podcast in various times, is all this stuff that was right before us, and we just had to shift our vision a little bit. And that's why I always say that.
That's why I love science. I mean, anyway, I love those moments. Those are the epiphanies that make you look back over the years and think, wow, I remember when we stumbled on that one.
Yeah, exactly. And that's why no biologist should ever be bored or run out of ideas. There is so much there. You just have to come at it from maybe a slightly different angle if you're a little bit stumped.
But you have to learn how to see it differently. And sometimes that's harder to do than people realize. Even if you're trying to look at things differently, it doesn't mean you actually see things differently. I mean, I can remember some of the big turning points in the history of my stuff. And it often takes something going spectacularly wrong. So I remember, can I give you an example? I remember a bunch of years ago when I was a postdoc, and I was very interested in trade-offs among traits, and I was really interested in costs of producing a big structure like a horn. And so I had found a set of papers by a biologist in Japan, Kazuo Kawano, that had been looking at rhinoceros beetles, and he'd argued that in species with the biggest horns, the wings were disproportionately small. So it suggested that there's this resource allocation trade-off between weapons and wings, fighting dispersal. I got very, very excited by this. And he was using dead specimens. It was just measures of collections. It was a pattern, but it was a really exciting pattern. And so here I was then a postdoc at Duke, and I was looking at dung beetles, a different group of beetles, and they have all these crazy horns. And I'd gotten a species that had a really big pair of head horns on the back of the head. And I had done a bunch of experiments in the lab, and I'd raised a bunch of these animals, and I was really excited to see if there was evidence of trade-offs there too. And I'd gone to great lengths to measure eyes, legs, wings, all these other structures, But honestly, come on, I mean, it was going to be wings. I went in expecting it to be wings because that's what Kawano had found. And so I remember the night, late at night, I'd been measuring all these hours at the scope, and I finally typed in all the data because I had to know, and I plotted the horns versus wings graph, and there was nothing. And I sat there dumbfounded. I mean, I actually think I got plastered drunk. I shouldn't say that in a podcast. I was really depressed. I had a lot of the ideas that I built around my postdoc were sort of hanging on there being an allocation trade-off associated with these traits. And I went and looked for it, and it wasn't there. And so there I was stuck. And I remember sitting there probably hungover the next morning, and my wife says, you know, you measured all these other traits too. You might as well look, right? You took the measurements. And so then I sat down all sort of in a slump, and I sat down and I started looking, okay, well, so there's nothing between horns and wings, but is anything else there? And it popped off the page. There was a trade-off between horns and eyes. And it was really striking. I mean, there was a real pattern there. And then I was like, why eyes? What the heck is going on there? And just like that, it was one of these epiphany moments. It's like, wait a minute. These things are located in different parts of the body. And so we came up with this idea that traits are sort of locally competing for resources within the body of the insect, and that the species that Kawano was working on had a horn on the thorax, which is next to the wings, and I was looking at a species with horns on the head, which is next to the eyes. And so we stumbled by accident on an idea that ended up, for a while at least, giving us a lot of traction and guiding a lot of, now I'm not so sure I buy even that idea, science being science, but it was a really important sort of change of perspective moment that completely changed the way that we looked at these mechanisms, completely changed the approach we were taking to study the system, and it happened by accident because what I thought I was going to find I didn't find. So that's a long-winded sort of anecdote, but I think it's extremely important to look outside of the box. I'm just trying to say that, at least based on my experience, sometimes it's a lot harder to do than you think, and sometimes you have to get knocked down before you sort of look around you going, oh my God, what the heck is going on? And that's when the epiphanies hit.
Yeah, finding the epiphanies is the hard part, and surviving the knockdowns as well is also the hard part. I want to get back to the storytelling aspect of it, of the book, and your ability to do that, really well. Because I think a lot of animal weapons, the book, not so much the actual morphologies, can be broken down into the 3 parts. So one part is your filing cabinet of really cool biology that you've accumulated over your career. The other part is, you tying it into military history and into human weapons and the arms races that we go through. But the third part, which is maybe a little more subtle, is almost like a personal biography of yourself and a whole lot of stories from the field, which you use to help draw the reader in and get them thinking along the same lines and trying to find their own epiphanies about what you're writing about. How did you go from, like you said, academic professor to accomplished storyteller, as you said, and using all 3 of these different tools to tell one cohesive story?
It was hard. So honestly, I try to put myself back into the mindset of where I was when I sat down with a blank page and was sitting out to write this book, because I think that a lot of us in academia feel like writing for a broad audience is going to be easy. Just, it relaxes all the constraints. I don't have to be quite so concise. I can use a broader repertoire of words. I'll get better adjectives. You have this sense of like, I get to really loosen up now. It is so much harder than that. And so I was trying to write these chapters, and I was trying to not use jargon, and I was trying to make them as intuitive as possible. And I take writing really seriously. So I had written, and I'm not a fast writer, so I'd worked on these chapters. I had a block of especially the intro chapters that I'd worked on, and I'd polished, and I'd shared them with colleagues and friends and a bunch of different people, and tried to polish and polish and polish. And by the time I sent them to my editors, I thought they were in pretty good shape. And they tossed them right back saying, this is terrible, start over. And okay, so I did. I started over. I spent another couple months rewriting the intro chapters, tried to come up with an even better, smoother way to do it, and they said, no, still terrible, you got to do it again. And I remember calling my editors, like, what is wrong? I mean, this is polished. I mean, I teach writing. I'm not trying to sound like I'm full of myself, but I actually think I know how to write. These are polished. What is wrong? And she's like, oh, you sound like a professor. And honest to God, I blurted out. It's like, I am a professor. It's like, yeah. And she's like, great. go be a professor, but we're done because that's a non-starter. Yeah, I'm not going to write. You're not doing a book with us if you're going to sound like a professor, because nobody wants to be taught. Your readership isn't looking for a lesson. They don't want you to teach them anything. You need to tell them a story, and that was a pretty fundamental turning point for me. How do you tell a story? And there's a double whammy, right? So if I'm writing a textbook, you put the intro material in the intro. You can do the backgrounds, and then you get to the later stuff. And, the students are going to read it because the professor's going to say, hey, you got to read chapters 1 and 2 for this week. So you assign it, so they read it. It's not the same with a book like this. You've got to grab people from the beginning or it's dead. And you got to hold on to them all the way through. You can't do a remedial background chapter or the book is dead. But you have to cover the background. So how do you write introductory chapters that make the concepts that you need to have in place so that you can move forward without it feeling remedial, without it feeling like you're teaching them or summarizing something? It was unbelievably difficult. I tried and I tried and I tried. And finally, in the end, it came to trying to tell the backstories, trying to add personal anecdotes, and trying to figure out ways to how do you explain the concept of natural selection? The problem I had there is, first of all, if you tally 100 people on the street, they'll all tell you they understand natural selection. Honestly, 3/4 of them won't, but they think they do. So how do you teach them something that they think they know, but they don't, in a way so that they get it right without being insulted or feeling like you're patronizing or feeling like you're teaching them? It's hard. And so I ended up telling stories. And I remember my editor's assistant saying, you can tell stories about animals too. It doesn't just have to be you. I remember trying to figure out, and so there's a section in there where I try to introduce the idea of natural selection from the perspective of a mouse. It's like bursting out into the dark, and all of a sudden, boom, there's 2 mice running across the grass, and one of them's dead, and there's like blood splattered on the ground. I mean, who would think of introducing natural selection that way? But it was an attempt to pull the reader into the mindset of the animal and get them to experience selection, so that I could then set up the idea of selection in a way that wouldn't feel dry. And so learning how to try to tell stories in ways that would be light and truly jargon-free and accessible was so much harder than I thought. And one of the things they kept saying is, we want more stories. We want more anecdotes. And at first I was like, well, why would anybody want to read about me? I mean, it's not a biography of some famous person. I'm just the author. Why? And they kept saying, no, we want that stuff. The stories make it fun. And I remember around that time, the evolution meetings in Ottawa, I think it was Ottawa, David Quammen gave the keynote address on sort of reaching broad audiences, and he said, people want to read about people. It's like, you might want to write about slime molds or, whatever, bract fungi or beetles. People want to read about people. So if you're going to tell your story about biology, you have to make it about people. And so I started trying to loosen up, and it was fun. I got to go back. I had a whole bunch of letters I'd written when I was a grad student in Panama, and my wife was back at Duke as a grad student, and this was before email and Skype, and so I'd written out longhand all these letters, and I used it as each week I would ride this boat into town to play Ultimate Frisbee, and I had this 45-minute boat ride where there's like no internet, right? We're pre-internet. You can't do anything. And I would write down all the crazy things that had happened that week, and it got to be this ritual. I'm so glad I did that, because I had all these letters there, and I got to go back through them and relive so many things that happened to me when I was back in Panama as a grad student. And so I started trying to find ways to tell those stories. And again, it started out as a tool. How do I try to make material less boring? It ended up something that I started stilted and sort of awkward at, but I got more and more comfortable with it. I guess I feel like it took a long time, but I feel like I found my voice, so to speak, and I started having more and more fun telling those stories. And then it got to the point where they'd say, hey, you don't have a story here. Give us another story. And so all the chapters have them in one way or another. And I started out being very uncomfortable with it, and in the end I ended up loving it. It makes the book very personal. It's, like it or not, for better or worse, that book has a lot of me in it, because I had to dig deep and find crazy anecdotes from things that had happened in the field to try to bring the material to life. And then in the end, I ended up feeling pretty excited about it, because I feel like it's a way to show people the process of science. Not tell them, show them. Just sort of by living the stupid things that I did, you get to sort of experience what it's like to be a scientist doing science. Whether it works or not, I don't know, but that's what it was there for. It was a very deliberate attempt to make this. So here I said, Quammen's quote rings true. People want to read about people. Well, now a third of the book, as you say, is crazy stories about me, so that's people. And then a third of the book, or half the book, is about military technology, so that's people. So the animals almost get shortchanged, although I don't think that they do. But I mean, it ended up, yeah, it's a long-winded answer. It was a process that wasn't planned from the start. It just sort of happened along the way.
But I think it's a really good blend of, even when you go through the experiments, because I think it's good for scientists too. Because sometimes when we read books that are for the general population, they feel really dumbed down. This doesn't feel like this, because you still keep all the details of the experiments in there. But you make, the story about the howler monkey and collecting the poop, and everything's so vivid. When you talk about the fiddler crab, and you're going back and forth, and you're saying, this is if, imagine yourself carrying, 3 bags of dog food in a cinder block. That's just incredible. It's really, really great. It's just good stuff. I like it a lot.
Well, I am trying to convey to you, though, that this was a process. I mean, I loved the process. I've already sort of hinted that it's the most intense and rewarding thing I think I've ever done as an academic. But I don't want to pretend it was easy, and I had really good help. I had editors that were willing to take a chance on somebody who'd never written a trade book and who had the guts to throw it back at me and say, this is terrible, you have to do it again. And I should also shout out, I have a colleague, I've been working very closely with Carl Zimmer on a textbook on evolutionary biology, another project which I'm really proud and glad that I took a chunk of my life to do. But Carl is a brilliant writer, and he took the time to read this manuscript early on, and he finally, I remember him writing me saying, look, I'm not going to, yeah, we're friends, I'm not going to be nice. This is me being nice. I'm going to be ruthless, and I'm going to treat it just like I would if it was one of my students. And he gutted it. But it was some of the most valuable comments I've ever gotten. And again, it took people like that, people who are willing to say, all right, if you really want to make this work, you're going to have to work for it. It takes more. And who took the time and had the patience to literally shred it and then show me why they shredded it and help me learn from that process how to do it better. And I give myself a little credit. I had to be willing to take some pretty hard hits, not take it personally, and sit down and put the time. It added a year to the project. Sit down and put the time in to try it again and again and again, and learn from these, these tips that these people were sharing and try to get it right. So, it makes my day that you're talking about it like you enjoy the writing so much, because I don't take that for granted at all now.
Yeah,
I feel like there's a lot of academics that want to write a broad book, and they'll loosen up a little bit. They'll have an introduction that's very personal and light and fun, and then it's like a light switch. Okay, did that. Then they're right back into science mode, and they might be loosening it up a little bit and using more space to explain stuff than they would in a journal article, but it's still basically a journal article. And I tried to not do that. I wanted the whole thing from beginning to end to feel light and fun and engaging, and none of it feel technical. And I don't think I pulled that off, but I tried hard to come close.
Yeah, well, I think you did pull it off. I thought one thing that's interesting, maybe we can go into a little bit here before we start rounding this off, is you talk a lot about taking the academic out of your public writing, but what about bringing the public writing into your academics? So I think, going through your website, I think you teach a course at University of Montana called The Art of Writing Effective Grant Proposals, and the fact that you call it the art of seems to be fairly implicative here. And also your work has gotten a lot of media attention in the popular media and science reporting, and I wonder if all these things are starting to coalesce and become related. So do you find that your writing style, both for grants, which you've been very successful in, as well as your academic publications, has started to reflect more of this public storytelling aspect that you've used so effectively in your book?
Yes. So two things. So first of all, the art of writing effective grant proposals, I do think it's an art. And I taught it as an art before I ever wrote this book. So I actually took it incredibly seriously long before I learned any of the lessons I just talked about in terms of writing this book. And a lot of effective writing, I believe, and I try to teach, it's the same with public speaking and giving talks too, is trying to put yourself in the mindset of your audience so that you understand where they're coming from and what their priorities are likely to be. And when you write a grant proposal, a lot of it comes down to recognizing the realities of the reviewers that are going to be reading it and trying to cater to that. I mean, simple things that you wouldn't think about, like, I've served on NSF panels, and I'll tell you, most of the academics, this is my biggest tip on grant proposal writing. I'll mention it now in case grad students or anybody is listening here. People are busy. Academics are unbelievably busy. I barely have time to breathe or go to the bathroom in the middle of a typical day. It's nonstop. Boom, 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 boom. And the emails are dumping in all the time. It's this constant battle to stay ahead of the chaos. I mean, I love it. I don't want to lie. I love biology and I love academia, but it will suck you dry. So people in academia are frantically busy all the time. So how do you then take somebody who is going to go serve on a grant panel and ask them to read something like 25 full grant proposals? I mean, come on, who's got time to do that? Much less think about them, analyze it, really put together whether you think these things deserve to be funded, and then write a review of that grant. That takes a lot of time. And so I remember, what I end up having to do, and everybody has their own trick, but I hate getting up really, really early in the morning. I'm not one of these people that wakes up at 5 ready to go. It's painful for me to get up that early in the morning. But what I would do, I remember this vividly, though. I mean, I would get up 2 hours earlier than I normally would. My house would be silent. My kids are still asleep. Everybody's still asleep. I would get up, make a cup of coffee, sit down, and I'd have 2 hours of sacred, absolutely uninterrupted silence when I could work on a proposal before kids got up, chaos happens, everybody's off to the races, boom, my day goes nonstop the whole day till I'm exhausted and crash in bed and ready to sleep. And then the next morning, I would get up and do it again. So for 25 days before a panel, I would get up 2 hours earlier than I normally do. And I had 2 hours of absolutely, utterly sacred, high-quality time. And that's all I could give each proposal. And I find it useful for students to think about that because they might spend a ton of time. In fact, I argue that if you want to get funded, you should be spending 100 to 200 hours on a proposal. You don't put these things off to the last minute. They need to be really well-crafted documents. You're going to put all that time into this, and they're going to read it for, what, 2 hours? That's it? But that's actually a lot. I mean, that's offering a lot. But if you're assuming that this person's going to give it a day, you're naive. And so you need to write it so that it's front-loaded, it's accessible, and it's beautiful and colorful and something that they're going to enjoy looking at. And you need to have it be modular so that if I have to get up to go to the bathroom because I've been drinking coffee for an hour and a half, I don't have to come back and go, God, where was I? Oh, shoot, they were going to do this. And then I go back, oh, no, I have to go back an earlier page. What was their question again? You build this sucker in modules so that each part of it is standalone. And so there's structure that goes into these things to make it user-friendly. So that's what I meant by the art of writing grant proposals is really put thought into what you're going to say, into the science, into your questions, and then put a ton of time into the document so that you've crafted something that is a joy to read. Because that's helping control one of the only parts of the process that you have any control over. There's still all kinds of other stuff you can't control that can play out, but that's the piece of the equation that you can control, and you might as well use it to its fullest. So I really believe in writing, but I want to come back to your question about did the writing the book change things? The answer is yes. I don't know how to turn it off. I'm reading student papers now. I'm reading, manuscripts that people in my lab are working on now, and I can't help it. It's like I read it and I'm editing and I'm constantly editing, and I find that I'm editing in ways that make the whole thing light and clear and fun. And on the one hand, that's great because there's no reason that academic writing should have to be dry. But on the other hand, I know I'm going to get hammered by an editor one of these days. It's going to be like, what the hell is this? What are you thinking? I honestly don't know how to switch back. And I guess it's a recent enough phenomenon that I don't know yet whether I'm going to get in trouble for that. I kind of feel like writing well is writing well, and it shouldn't matter. Everybody would rather read something that's beautifully written. But it's not as simple as that, because you can write beautifully in a much more controlled academic format that is much more concise than what I've been doing lately. And I don't know how to turn it off. I don't know if I want to turn it off. I like writing this other way, but I am going to get in trouble pretty soon, I think. And you'll have, again, this will be a tune-in next time. How did he figure out how to shut it off and go back to being an academic again?
Yeah, I think it's a good problem to have. I think it's a great problem to have, and I hope you don't turn it off because I think we really need to see more engaging writing in scientific papers all that. Bucking the trend of being long-winded and boring is a good trend to buck, I think. I hope that you spearhead that.
That's how I rationalize it myself. That's how I pitch it to my students. And I think the people in the lab are all having fun with it too, because they're all sort of picking up on it and running with it. These lessons are very valid, sort of wide-reaching lessons in terms of understanding your audience and figuring out how to explain things that don't use jargon. It's fun.
Yeah, hopefully if you guys can push ahead with that, then we can all follow suit without fear of reprisals from editors.
It'll make reading papers and grant proposals a lot more enjoyable.
So I think that pretty much brings us to a close. Thank you so much for talking to us about all this. We covered a lot of ground today, and I hope everybody at home enjoys this very special episode 100. Where can people at home follow along with your research, as well as any future book or popular writing that may come out?
Well, I have a faculty webpage that's tied into the University of Montana, and I guess I can probably send you a link to that, right, that you can put on the page. And I have an author page, too, that's through Macmillan Press, but I guess I confess I'm not as good at updating that as much. And I have an author page on Facebook, but I'm not very good at posting on that either, but I'll get better. No,
Awesome.
But I guess the new thing is I have an author page through Macmillan, which is the publisher, Henry Holt Macmillan, and I have an author page that's connected to the University of Montana. So thanks. No,
Awesome.
seriously, thanks, you guys. And this was fun because we didn't just talk about, what's the story of the weapons, or what's the parallel, or the doom and gloom. Why do we think that the latest and greatest technologies in the military arsenals might be obsolete? We didn't go that way. We went to the backstory, to how did you get there, and why did you do it the way you did it, and that was fun for me. So hopefully that was useful for you.
That was super useful. I found it great, and thank you for going there with us. And like you said, we will have links to all of your websites and various things, as well as some of the stuff that we talked about, and a link to where people can get your book, Animal Weapons, online. We'll put all of that on our website, like we usually do, at breakingbio.com for those listening at home. So I think we'll leave it there. We'll head off into the world of what I assume is syndication now that we're past episode 100, and I hope everybody at home joins us as we go through 100 more episodes, perhaps. Of course, you can follow us online and see how we get there by following Breaking Bio on Twitter, at Breaking Bio, on Facebook as well, by searching for the Breaking Bio podcast. And, of course, you can take us and listen to all 100 episodes that we've already recorded by looking for us on iTunes and Stitcher. Thank you very much once again, Doug, and everybody at home, thanks for your continued listening.
Yeah, I hope everyone goes out and gets this book. When I was reading it, I kept thinking, like, oh man, he would love this. Like, I should get it for this person. They would totally love this. So I'm probably going to buy a lot of copies. So if your sales go up, spike right after this. You're like, Heidi, thank you.
I will, thank you. No, I appreciate it, you guys. This has been fun.